tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mosby, Cottontails, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sand bank, underneath the root of a very big fig tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mr. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. Rachel's garden. Your father had an accident there. He will put in a pie my Mr. Gritters. Now run along, but don't get into the mischief. I am going out." Then old Mr. Rabbit took a basket and the umbrella, and went through the wood to the baker. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail were good little bunny, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. Gritter's gardens, and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuce and French beans, and then he ate some radishes. But around the end of a cucumber frame was Sammy meat by Mr. Granger. Mr. Granger was on his hands and knees panting up our young cabbage, but he jumped up and ran up to Peter, waving a red and calling out, "Stop there!" Peter was most dreadfully driven. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbage, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went farther, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately to a sparrow net, and got caught by the large button on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass button, white new. Peter gave himself a for loss, and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrow, who flew to him in great excitement, and implored him to exit himself. Mr. Grater came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wiggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. Peter rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, if it had not but had so much water in it. Mr. Rachel was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under it. Presently Peter sneezed. "Get to school!" Mr. Rachel was after him in no time. Mr. Rachel tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 planes. The window was too small for Mr. Critter, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he had very done with sitting in that can. After a time he began to wander about, going lippity not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fast little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone to stem, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had shut a large pea in the mud that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. Ritter filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very still, but now and then the tip of her tongue twitched as if she were a leaf. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had brought about cats from his cousin, the Benjamin Bunny. He went back to what the tool said, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a horse screech. Scratch, scratch, screech. Peter